اور محمد وآل محمد صلوات صلی علی محمد وآل محمد. اعوذ باللہ من الشیطان الرجیم. بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم. I begin in the name of Allah, the most beneficent and merciful. All praise belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for blessing us with existence and granting us the opportunity to move towards Him. Respected ulama, Maulana, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Adamallahu ujurana wa ujurakum bimusabina bil Hussein alayhi salam. Waja'allana wa iyyakum min at-talibina bisarihi ma'a waliyahil imam al-mahdi min ali Muhammad alayhi salam. Brothers and sisters, tonight we're holding the first Majalis of the series of 2 Majalis which will held tonight and also tomorrow night. As you know, these Majalis will be addressed by Hujjatul Islam, Maulana Faiyaz Jafar of New York. With this we continue the journey of Azadari, the journey of sadness and grief, where we offer Pursa to Bibi Sayyida Fatima Salamullah Alaiha. As we get ready for this night, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to eradicate this disease of COVID-19 from this world and protect all mu'mineen worldwide, inshallah. We'll start the majlis with the recitation of Salam and Marsiya. For that, I would like to request Brother Shafqat Shah to please come forward. Please welcome him with a loud salawat.
بارہ دیگر ہدیے سلوات. افسوس نبی زادیوں کا شام میں جانا، سجاد سے پوچھو. افسوس نبی زادیوں کا شام میں جانا، سجاد سے پوچھو. سر ننگے وہ ماں بہنوں کا دربار میں جانا، سجاد سے پوچھو. چھپتی تھی نبی زادی کے پیچھے، کس شرم و حیا سے اور شمر کا ان بیبیوں کے نام بتانا، سجاد سے پوچھو. افسوس نبی زادیوں کا شام میں جانا، سجاد سے پوچھو بیٹھے ہوئے دربار میں سب چھوٹے بڑے تھے سادات کھڑے تھے سر تشت میں رکھا ہوا زینب کو دکھانا سجاد سے پوچھو جب دختر شبیر نے زندان میں قضا کی آفت کی گھڑی تھی وہ ننھی سی میت بندھے ہاتھوں سے اٹھانا سجاد سے پوچھو جب غسل سکینہ کو وہاں دے چکی غصہ تھا سب کا برا اس ننھی سی میت پہ نشان رسی کے پانا سجاد سے پوچھو افسوس نبی زادیوں کا شام میں جانا سجاد سے پوچھو صلوات پر محمد بارے دیگر حجی صلوات ایک واری سر میں کبابیدہ سجاد بھرا ملوائے میرا وعدائے بلنا روساں ایک واری سر میں کبابیدہ سجاد بھرا ملوائے میرا وعدائے بلنا روساں میں کو پیو مظلوم دے ایک واری رخسار ذرا چموائے میرا وعدائے بلنا میں کو خاک تے نندر نہیں آندی جڑا سمدی ہاں گل دکھ ویندے میں کو شمار تماچے مارے میں کو شمار تماچے مارے میرے رخسار گوائے میرا وعدائے بلنا روساں ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਸਰ ਮੈਂ ਕੁੰਬਾਬੇ ਦਾ ਸੱਜਾਦ ਭਿਰਾ ਮਿਲਵਾਏ ਮੇਰਾ ਵਾਦਾ ਏ ਵਲਨਾ ਰੋਸਾਂ 4 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਦੀ ਮਾਸੂਮਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਰ ਦੇ ਵਾਲ ਸਫੈਦ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਮੈਂ ਵਾਂਗ ਜ਼ਈਫਾ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਹਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਵਾਂਗ ਜ਼ਈਫਾ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਹਾਂ ਗਿਆ ਦੁੱਖ ਬਾਬੇ ਦਾ ਖਾਏ ਮੇਰਾ ਵਾਦਾ ਏ ਵਲਨਾ ਰੋਸਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਸਰ ਮੈਂ ਕੁੰਬਾਬੇ ਦਾ ਸੱਜਾਦ ਭਿਰਾ ਮਿਲਵਾਏ ਮੇਰਾ ਵਾਦਾ ਏ ਵਲਨਾ ਰੋਸਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਪਿਓ ਦੀ ਮਾਤਮਦਾਰ ਜਦਾਂ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾਨੇ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਚ ਮਰ ਵੈਸਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਪਿਓ ਦੀ ਮਾਤਮਦਾਰ ਜਦਾਂ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਾਨੇ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਚ ਮਰ ਵੈਸਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਕੋ ਦਫਨ ਕਰੇ ਸੱਜਾਦ ਭਿਰਾ ਮੈਂ ਕੋ ਦਫਨ ਕਰੇ ਸੱਜਾਦ ਭਿਰਾ यो मेला चोला पाए मेरा वादा ए वलना रोसां एक वारी सर में कुंबाबे दा सज्जाद भिरा मिलवाए मेरा वादा ए वलना रोसां सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि मुहम्मद
Jazakallah Shafqat Bhai for his sehat, salamti, sustenance and rizq. Please recite a loud salawat. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I just have a few quick announcements before I invite Maulana to address the Majalis. The second Majalis for the series of these 2 Majalis will continue tomorrow. Same timing, we'll start right after Maghrib and Isha prayers, inshallah. We'll continue the series of Thursday Majalis on this coming Thursday, September 2nd. And again, we'll start with the Maghriban prayers. And of course, those Majalis are being addressed by Hujjatul Islam, Maulana Amir Mukhtar Faizi. Ladies Majalis will continue on Saturday at 10:30 a.m. So the next Majalis will be on this coming Saturday at 10:30. And these Majalis are being addressed by Sister Maryam Ali Tahir. Next set of weekend Majalis will be next Saturday and Sunday. The timing will be the same, and those Majalis will be addressed by Hujjatul Islam, Maulana Rizwan Arastu, inshallah. Brothers and sisters, please join Baitul Ilm to care for our Afghan brothers and sisters by supporting and purchasing the care packages. The care packages will be handed out as refugees arrive at the airport. You can donate by check or cash. These funds will be used to buy these care packages, which will include clothes, blankets, shoes, socks, and other basic necessities. Like I mentioned, please make checks payable to Imami with Afghan help at the bottom of the memo. Collection has already begun. If you have further questions and you want more details, please get in touch with Brother Jawad Hussain. Tonight's Majlis is being sponsored by the families of Brother Ahmad Jivani and Sister Sukaina Najfi for increase in their tawfiqat and acceptance of their and all mu'mineen's hajat. Please recite a loud salawat. Salli ala Muhammad wa They have requested a special dua sehat for brother Ahmad Jivani for his health, safety, quick recovery. Please recite a loud salawat. They have requested the Surah Fatiha for the Isale Sawab of all of their marhumeen, especially for Marhuma Fatima Karimi and Marhum Muhammad Bakir Karimi and Marhum Muntazir Dhanji, and for all of their and your Marhum Mu'mineen and Mu'minat preceded by a loud salawat. Tonight we have the honor to host a renowned scholar from New York, Hujjatul Islam, Maulana Faiyaz Jafar. Before I invite him, I just wanted to offer a quick introduction. Shaykh Faiyaz Jafar is the research scholar for Islamic Center at New York University and associate chaplain for the Center of Global and Spiritual Life at NYU. In addition, he is currently a doctoral candidate at NYU Steinhardt School of Education, where he is currently writing his dissertation on the religious development of Shia students in institutions of higher educations. Shaykh Faiyaz attained a master's degree in Islamic studies in UK with concentration on early Islamic history. After his undergraduate degree from SUNY in political science and religious studies, he has had his research published by academic journals. In pursuing the classical course of Islamic education, Shaykh Faiyaz has studied in Seminary of Karbala, Iraq, one of the most prominent centers of Islamic learning. Now, without further ado, I would like to request Shaykh Faiyaz Jafar to the member to address the Majalis. Please welcome him with a loud salawat.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المذلومين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة، يا غريب يا مظلوم يا أتشان كربلاء. ما خاب من تمسك بكم والأمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي. يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم والقول الحق والأصدق القائلين: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، لقد كان في قصصهم إبرة لأولي الألباب. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلى الله عليه وسلم. Oftentimes, amongst the most fascinating and interesting and perhaps most debatable of the conversations that we get into when it comes to the Islamic sciences is in regards to certain aspects of early Islamic history. whereby we see that within our reports and within our traditions, there are differences of takes and opinions and perspectives in terms of how we land at details with regards to any particular occasion. And even as something as basic as the day of the birth of the greatest of God's creations, our messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know that there is debate. That there is debate and conversation with regards to the actual day of his birth, whether it's the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal or the 17th of Rabi al-Awwal. Of course, popularized within many of our communities that we celebrate the birth of the Messenger of God on the 12th, on the 17th, while there are at the same time some of our early ulama who stated that it was on the 12th of the month of Rabi al-Awwal. There is debates with regards to the day, for instance, of the martyrdom of Imam al-Hasan, whether it's the 7th of Safar or the 29th of Safar or the 27th of Safar. Similarly, with regards to the day of the martyrdom of Imam Ali al-Rada. Similarly, with regards to the days in which we recollect the tragedy of Lady Fatima alayhi salam, whether it was 40 days after the passing of the Prophet, or 75 days after the passing of the Prophet, or 90 days after the passing of the Prophet, or even, as some historians have argued, perhaps up to 120 days after the passing of the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when we take a look at all of these different reports and different traditions and different narrations, people, they ask questions with regards to exactly why is it that we differ in such a way when we're talking about individuals who are the most important personalities within our religious tradition. We see these individuals as the representatives of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. Yet how can we differ in the way that we do with regards to events that are as important and significant as these dates? Because I know the birthday of my children, I know the birthday of my parents, I know the birthday of my grandparents, and by oral tradition I can probably trace back the birthday of my great-great-grandparents as well. But when it comes toward the Messenger of God, or when it comes to the days of the commemoration of the leader of the women of paradise, why is it that we differ in regards to these details? For today's discussion, inshallah, I want to reflect upon some of these questions, but specifically through the lens of understanding differences when it comes to the reporting of the maqtal of Imam al-Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam, and the way that we understand the tragedy of the king of martyrs, Abu Abdullah, Salamullah alayhi. Allahumma. But before we get into our discussion for this evening, just a little bit of a brief introduction. And that is that it's super important for us to understand that the science of history is very different than the science of theology or of law of jurisprudence. Meaning it's a fallible science that's been compiled by historians who many a time lived during those particular events, but at the same time where we see that history itself was many a time written many years later. Even when we take a look at the development of how we understand historical texts in the secular world or in American academia, for instance, the historical method is often within threefold. The first fold is in terms of gathering as many sources as we possibly can, and then differentiating them between primary sources and secondary sources. You went to high school in this country, you know that this is something that we study from, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, up until we graduate high school. What are primary sources versus what are secondary sources? Which is that which is going to be that much more relied upon? Primary sources. Primary sources being the actual evidences as that particular event was taking place. Let's take a little bit of a brief example in order for us to kind of break this out a little bit further. 50 years from today, every single one of us have lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. And the way that we talk to this event to our children is going to be on a first-hand experience. We experienced it. We saw it. We were drowned in illness, financial hardship, mortality. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon all of those from our community who passed away from this horrific disease. The way that we talk about it is very unique. And if our grandchildren, they're going to be writing reports on this 50 years from today, in addition to hearing the reports of every single one of us and what it is that we experience, they're going to rewind back to that which is available on the cloud. They're going to go to articles in regards to the New York Times or what was present in the Wall Street Journal during May and April 2020 to see how everything was unfolding, because again, those are the most primary sources that they can find in regards to this particular historical incident. So the first stage when it comes toward understanding or reflecting or sort of deducing any particular conclusion when it comes to history is gathering together as many sources as you possibly can and then differentiating that which is a primary source versus a secondary source. A secondary source, for instance, being something that was written many years later, not at the actual moment. The second phase of this process, as is often studied within the historical method, again, within many universities and institutions of academia today, is again to go through a synthesis process. What does that mean? That we go ahead and take a look at the sources that we have in front of us and try to see that if those who wrote, those who reported, those who presented are speaking with any form of bias. Naturally, when you take a look at everything that we've seen over the last year and a half, with regards to this particular same example, there is bias through a lens of sociopolitics. There's a bias through a lens of the economy. Those individuals who, for instance, don't support the wearing of masks, they're going to present a different narrative with regards to how they understood this pandemic. Where did this pandemic start from? Again, we have to go ahead, or it's the job of a historian, to go ahead and determine and to synthesize through these historical sources in terms of, again, deducing that information which is most accurate. And then thirdly and finally, the historian, after gathering together all of the sources, identifying the primary versus the secondary, then trying to weed out all of the biases and try to weed out all of the perhaps, misconceptions or lack of detail, the final and the most important responsibility of the historian is then to come and to present their narrative of history. And you'll see that a historian is never going to say, this is absolutely what happened. But rather they're going to say, from these sources, we believe that this is what has happened. And when it comes toward understanding the tragedy of Karbala, the story of Imam al-Hussein, alayhi salam, in the Maqta literature more broadly, we come and we see that things don't differ very much from the way that we understand history in this part of the world. And for today's discussion, inshaAllah ta'ala, and we'll continue tomorrow, I want to reflect upon some of the sources of the Karbala tragedy or the Maqta literature in three different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of understanding some salient features when it comes toward the compilation of the literature surrounding the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Secondly, to go to those exact sources that speak to the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein and his martyrdom alayhi salam. And thirdly and finally, with regards to how we deal with all of these sources in front of us. So let's jump in right to the first phase of the discussion. And that is with regards to some of the important and salient features and characteristics to note when it comes toward understanding the literature that we have in front of us today. When you come and take a look at that which was taking place during the event of Ashura, that which was taking place on the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, that which led up to it, and certainly that which takes place thereafter, it's super important again for us to understand the socio-political circumstances by which the Imam alayhi salam was living. Like we know, the Imam alayhi salam is living under the rule of the Umayyad dynasty. And thus the Umayyad narrative of how history takes place and how the tragedy of Karbala unfolded naturally is going to differ, for instance, than the way that the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam would read their understanding of the tragedy of their Imam. Which is why we gather these ways like we have for the last several centuries, because we feel that the remembrance of Imam al-Hussein, or we know with certainty that the remembrance of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is an opportunity for us to cultivate a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That this is a demonstration of our love and adoration and fidelity to the Prophet and his family. We are fulfilling the covenant or the command by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Messenger of God to say that I want nothing from you, O Ummah, except mawaddatan fil qurba. Except that you love my family. And so through my wearing of black, or through my grief, or through my gathering in the name of Imam al-Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam, I'm demonstrating my love for this family. I'm demonstrating my love for the messenger. And through this remembrance, I'm able to walk in their footsteps and eventually seek closeness and proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How is the Umayyad reading going to be? The Umayyad reading is naturally going to be that this particular man, and even many years later, the way that they're going to read it today, is that this particular man in the 1st or the 2nd century of Islam, 50 years after the passing of the Prophet, he rose against the authority of his time. And is stated by that famous Umayyad scholar, Ibn al-Bakr, Abi Bakr ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki, that Hussein alayhi salam was killed by the sword of his grandfather Muhammad. Meaning that he asked for this himself when he went and tries to wage this battle against the Umayyads. So when it comes to the Umayyad reading, naturally they're going to have their own lens. A second type of reading when it comes to the early events of the tragedy of Karbala, and perhaps the most prominent one, of course, is the Abbasid reading. When it comes toward the majority of the literature, or the early literature that we have, when it comes toward the tragedy of Karbala, this is narrated during the time of the Abbasid government, particularly by a man by the name of At-Tabari. Tabari, many of you may have heard from the member for many years. Tabari, the most perhaps famous historian when it comes to early Islamic history. At-Tabari, of course, is important for us to note that this particular individual is employed by the Abbasid government, meaning that his payment and his stipend is given to him by the Abbasid government. And the Abbasids, they wage a war against the Umayyads, meaning that they have animosity with regards to themselves. But nonetheless, their reading is also going to be void of sort of this theological approach. And it's important to understand that their version of history also may be biased and also may be tainted, again, due to the fact that this individual is being employed by the Abbasid government. And if you fast forward some generations after the tragedy of Karbala and that of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, there were many, many other revolutions that took place from those who were amongst the followers of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, during the time of the Abbasids, who sought to wage war against them in order to bring back rule and authority closer to the Alawis, closer toward the house and the children of Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace and blessings be upon him. Allah. So naturally there's going to be a bias from the Abbasids toward the children of Hussein alayhi salam. I'll give you one example. And that is that when you take a look, a lot of people don't know this, but it's really important for me to throw this out there. But when you take a look at the historical narrative of At-Tabari, when he talks about the martyrdom of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rada, Imam Ali ibn Musa Rada, the 8th Imam of Ahlul Bayt, who was he killed and poisoned by? The Abbasid government. And many a time when we narrate the maqtal of Imam Ali Rada alayhi salam, what do we say? We said that he was fed grapes that were filled with poison that he ate, and that he was martyred due to these poisoned grapes. At-Tabari narrates that Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, from the grandsons of Ali ibn Abi Talib, from the grandsons of the Messenger of God, he dies because he has an overdose on grapes. He eats too many grapes, and the Imam alayhi salam, he passes away due to this. Why? But look at the sort of nuance. Everyone within that early community knows the rank and the station of Imam Ali al-Rida. If At-Tabari doesn't narrate it, what's going to happen? It's a problem when it comes to history. He's supposed to be the government's narrative. Yet if he were to say that my bosses are the ones who poisoned Imam Ali al-Rida alayhi salam, what happens? He's likely to lose his job. The way that he narrates it is that Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rida alayhi salam dies because he eats too many grapes, and thus he passes away from this. So when we come toward understanding firstly this first dimension of the discussion, it's very important for us to recognize that when it comes toward the reports that we have with regards to the tragedy of Karbala, or the differences in the dates that we have in front of us, this science is a fallible science. meaning there is room for error. There wasn't always opportunity for the Imams of Ahlul Bayt or for that early Shi'i community to openly express that which took place with detail, which is why it's so important for us, again, to take a critical approach when we're reading many of these texts and understanding the context in which that they were presented and the way that they were deduced. And this brings me then toward the second dimension of the discussion, specifically with regards to the tragedy of Karbala and the maqtal of Imam al-Hussein, alayhi salatu wasalam. When it comes to the maqtal literature surrounding Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, when you take a look at it more broadly, many times people, they ask the question with regards to how we know what took place between the tents of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. How do we know what took place in the conversations between Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and Lady Zainab on the night of Ashura? How do we know the sermons of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam? How do we know how many people this person killed and how many people that person killed? And most people, they jump to the conclusion that the narration of the tragedy of Karbala is narrated by a man by the name of Hamid ibn Muslim. Hamid ibn Muslim, we often narrate. Hamid ibn Muslim, he says this on the day of Ashura, he did this on the day of Ashura. And most people, they believe that Hamid ibn Muslim was a journalist who was employed by the Umayyads, who is present on the day of Ashura and narrates the tragedy of Karbala. In reality, while this is an opinion held by many people, it doesn't have so much value when you take a look at the actual details and the actual sources surrounding the Karbala tragedy. Inshallah, we'll talk more about Hamid ibn Muslim tomorrow, but he is just one from amongst the many narrators of those who presented the story of Karbala. If we take a look at those who presented the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, we can perhaps break them up into 4 or 5 different groups. The first group of individuals are those who were present on the side of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, but lived beyond the tragedy of Karbala. Let me give you a couple of examples. Example number 1 is an individual by the name of Aqba ibn Sam'an. This individual, Aqba ibn Sam'an, is the servant or the slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And he himself, he narrates that I was present with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, near to him every single moment from the day that we left Medina until the day of Ashura. Likely, Aqba ibn Sam'an did not fight in the tragedy of Karbala on the day of Ashura, but he accompanied the women and the children and those who were injured throughout the rest of the journey. And he's a one from amongst the most important narrators of the tragedy of Karbala, the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. This is number 1. A second individual who accompanied Imam al-Hussein or was on the side of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is a famous man by the name of Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi. His story is very famous. This particular individual, al-Mashriqi, he made allegiance with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, but it was a conditional allegiance that he made with the Imam sallallahu. He says to Abu Abdullah that I will accompany you, you owe Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, but any time that I fear for my life or for my family or for my dignity, you have to let me go back. So Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam accepts him and accepts him on this condition. On the day of Ashura, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, every single one of his companions and every single one of his family members have been killed. And like we narrate that the Imam alayhi salam, he goes 10 to 10 looking to see if there's anyone else. This individual, Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi, is found by Imam al-Hussein. And the Imam tells him, this is your opportunity. He looks toward Abu Abdullah and he says, oh Imam al-Hussein, do you remember that allegiance that I pledged to you? It was conditional. The Imam says, yes. He says, then I'm ready to sort of unpledge my allegiance and go back home. The Imam alayhi salam says to him, he says, how are you going to get back home? He says, I hid one of my horses behind the tents and I'm going to go back. And the Imam alayhi salam tells him, get on your horse and go as fast as possible, because once you hear my call, that call of the Imam salamullah alayhi, And if you hear my voice and you don't respond to me, you're going to end up in trouble. So this individual, Al-Dhahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi, he is the individual who narrates everything which takes place from amongst the conversations of the ashab of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam on the night of Ashura. We know that, for instance, Habib ibn Madahir says this, Suhair ibn Qayn says this, Nafi ibn Hilal says this. One by one, the companions of Imam al-Hussein, they utter their pledges of loyalty to Abu Abdullah. These are narrated by this individual who fled the scene of Karbala. So this is individual number 2 from the side of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Thirdly, there's a man by the name of Mawaqi' or Mawaqi ibn Thumama al-Asadi, an individual who went and he fought valiantly in honor of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Both of his arms were severed on the day of Ashura. But like we said, his last name or this title is al-Athadi, meaning he comes from the tribe of Banu Athad, from the people of Karbala. And when the army of Umar ibn Sa'd went to eradicate the bodies of the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, they saw this man and they saw that he was alive but very wounded. Banu Asad, they came and they interceded on his behalf and they said, let him be taken as a prisoner, don't kill him. And Umar ibn Sa'd's army accepted. And another individual is a man by the name of Hassan al-Muthanna, the son of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. You know that the Sada from the line of Imam al-Hassan are plentiful. Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, every one of his other children present in Karbala, of course famously Qasim, every one of them were martyred except for Hassan al-Muthanna, Hassan II. This particular individual, again, fought, but was injured. And on the day of Ashura, after the Battle of Karbala, again, they noticed he was injured, but his wife's tribe was in the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, and they interceded for Hassan al-Muthanna, and from his line, the Sada from the line of Imam al-Hassan continue, and he accompanied the women and the children to Kufa as well. Okay, so this is group number 1, but we said there are 4 or 5 different groups of people. Group number 1, again, are those individuals who come from the line or who come from the side of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Secondly, of course, are the women and the children of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. Like we know, all of these important women, individuals like that of Lady Zainab alayhi salam, individuals like that of Sukaina, later on they narrate the tragedy of Karbala and they offer details with regards to conversations taking place, for instance, in the tent of the women, and those nuances and those details later. Of course, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam is present as well, which brings me to the third group of individuals. We have the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. We have an entire maqtal narrated by Imam al-Sadiq salamullah alayhi. Of course, many of that which he presented may be lost within history, but nonetheless, undoubtedly, we know that the Imam salamullah alayhi narrated some details with regards to the tragedy of Karbala. In addition, of course, we have the report, perhaps the literature of the maqtal of Imam al-Zaman, Imam al-Mahdi, ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah. In Ziyarat al-Nahi, of course, there's these 2 versions of the ziyarah of the Imam alayhi salam. One of them in which he actually speaks to some of the lines of poetry that they recited as they were exiting the tent and engaging in battle. So we're able to take certain glimpses from all of these different reports. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, when it comes toward those narrators of the tragedy of Karbala, we have a 4th or 5th group of individuals, and these, of course, are those from the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, meaning the enemies of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. For of course, they witnessed everything that took place on the 10th of Muharram. But the big question that someone might ask is, how can I take the word of the enemies of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam in terms of their narration of that which took place to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam? These are enemies, they're criminals. How can I take their word? First of all, it's important to note that even in sort of our judicial system in this country, that when someone self-incriminates, we take their value. We take them on their word. If someone says, I am the one who committed this crime, we accept their word. Similarly, we have a principle known in sort of Western history known as the criterion for embarrassment. This is the notion that when someone admits to doing something that is seemingly embarrassing in the community, no one would admit to embarrassing themselves unless they really did it. So when these individuals state that I am the one who struck the 6-month-old infant of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, in what value, in what world is that an utterance of pride that you killed a child? Not in that community, and certainly not in the world that we live in today. So we can take their word when they self-incriminate themselves. But what's important to note, what's really important to note, is that many a time, especially when it comes to villains like them, when they speak to that which they engaged in on the day of Ashura and on the 10th of Muharram, perhaps some of them, they made their statements and perhaps to set themselves free because they were living with this guilt. But others, they did not speak to the entirety of the detail of the tragedy or of that which they engaged in on the day of Ashura. It's possible. Many a times when we do something wrong, even if we want to say sorry to our parents or to our spouses or to our friends, we'll say sorry for one part of that which we're sorry for, but we're not ready to admit entirely that we're sorry for everything, even though we within ourselves entirely know that we did a lot more wrong than just this one utterance of the tongue that we uttered. So in reality, their testimony of that which took place on the day of Ashura can only be understood and can be accepted, but there may potentially be a whole nother floodgate of atrocities that had befallen upon the household of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Very good. Everyone following? Too much? Okay. So when we understand all of these important narratives from these different groups of individuals when it comes toward the tragedy of Karbala and the Maqta literature surrounding Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, the next question that we have to pose is, okay, all of them, they narrated all of these events, but to whom? And how did it collect? And who was it collected by? And how did it reach us today? What's important to note again over here is that by the 3rd century, when is the tragedy of Karbala? 61 years after Hijrah. By the year 290, about 230 years takes place, and we have upwards of 30 different texts which narrate the tragedy of Karbala, meaning that it was something popular, it was something well known, it was something that had spread all across the early Muslim community beyond the Shia pockets. It was a well-known event. This is the tragedy of the grandson of the Messenger of God, and we have 30 different reports, 30 different texts of 30 different individuals who have narrated the tragedy of Karbala in their own unique way with the sources that they had access to. Yet today, what do we have? We fast forward from the year 290 till this very day, we only have part of one, which we'll talk about more tomorrow, and that is known as the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf. But before that, there were numerous different individuals who had narrated the tragedy of Karbala. The first one of them is a man by the name of Asbagh ibn Nubata, famous companion of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali alayhi salam, who many a time when it comes to the night of the 22nd or the 20th of Ramadan, we narrate that Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he tells all of his family members to leave. He tells all of his companions to leave so he can spend the last moments of his life with his children. And as he's in the company of Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein and Lady Zainab, peace and blessings be upon them, they hear some crying outside. And Imam Ali tells Imam al-Hassan, go and see who is weeping outside. Imam Hassan goes to the door and he sees this loyal, loving companion of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, this man by the name of Asbagh ibn Nubata. He says to Asbagh, he says, oh Asbagh, why are you weeping? He says, I want one more glance at the face of my master Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. He comes inside, the Imam alayhi salam, he tells him, he says, oh Asbagh, don't cry for me, I'm going to go and see my brother, the Messenger of God. And he utters this famous line. He says, oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, I'm not weeping for what's going to happen to you, I'm weeping for myself. What is life like without Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam? This is Asbagh ibn Nubata. Asbagh ibn Nubata lives in the city of Kufa. He did not accompany Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam for a whole host of different reasons that we don't know. Perhaps due to his age, perhaps due to imprisonment, wallah. But the important thing to note is that Asbagh ibn Nubata, when many individuals returned back to Kufa, he was the first individual to narrate the tragedy of Karbala that began to spread across the early Muslim community. The reality is that that particular piece of literature hasn't reached us today. A second individual, for instance, who narrates the tragedy of Karbala and writes the maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is the famous companion of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, dies in the year 128 after Hijrah, a man by the name of Jafar ibn Yazid al-Ja'fi, this famous companion of the Imam alayhi salam, who is known for his staunch support of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. He also narrates the tragedy of Karbala, but unfortunately, again, this particular report also does not reach us. In addition, there was another contemporary of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, a man by the name of Ammar ibn Muawiyah al-Juhani, who also writes a maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Unfortunately, as well, it does not reach us. And finally, again, we have the maqtal of a man by the name of Lut ibn Yahya, famously known as Abi Makhdaf. Inshallah, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Lut ibn Yahya, an individual from the city of Kufa, where he narrates directly from many of those individuals who I just mentioned, directly from them because he interviewed them with regards to the events around the tragedy of Karbala, or by means of intermediaries. Intermediaries by one or two individuals between those who were present on the day of Ashura and Lut ibn Yahya, and he compiles this work known as Abi Makhnaf, the Maqtal of Abi Makhnaf, which unfortunately, again, has been reconstructed by many historians, particularly individuals like that of Al-Tabari, and also by our scholar Shaykh Al-Mufid, radwanullahi alayhi. Sallu ala Muhammad wa So again, my apologies, there's a little bit too many dates, but important for us to take away a couple of important glimpses. When it comes to all of these pieces of literature that we have with regards to the tragedy of Karbala and the story of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, someone can say, okay, we have all this information and half of it is lost. Why is any of this relevant to me at this very moment, in this particular gathering, in this particular age? I want to know what happened to my Imam. And is what is being narrated from the pulpit that which took place to the Imam alayhi salam or no? And the answer to this question in reality has many different dimensions to it. But the most important of which is for us to understand, point number one, that is that we can't focus solely on the details, but we have to focus on the theme. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states within the Holy Quran, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ إِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. That at the end of the day, the anecdotes that he presents within the Holy Quran himself are meant so that we take lesson from it, so that we take inspiration from it. A lot of times people may get caught up. I'll give you an example. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he uttered this famous line that when Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam was martyred, he states that my back has been broken. One report of the Maqtal states that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam utters this line when Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas leaves the tent to go and fetch water for the women and children. Others state, for instance, that when Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he saw the flag of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas fall, and when he reached his body, that the Imam alayhi salam, he uttered this line. Now over here we have two different contradictions. Someone, they might not accept it. At the end of the day, what does it show? It shows how close Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas was to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Whether he said it before or whether he said it later, it doesn't make a difference. Another example, when it comes toward the tragedy of Qasim, peace and blessings be upon him. Some reports state, for instance, that Qasim kills 35 people. Another narration states that he killed 3 people. Another report states that he killed 6 people. Does it really matter at the end of the day? At the end of the day, Qasim ibn al-Hasan, he went and he fought in honor of his uncle, Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. And he was martyred and he gave his life in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are we able to extract the themes of love, of generosity, of sacrifice, of mercy, of fidelity, of loyalty, of God consciousness, of taqwa from this narrative or no? And if we hone in and focus and zero in on details and only allow for these details to cause commotion and division and debate, what benefit is that? The tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam is as tragic by just stating that 50 years after the passing of the Messenger of God, 30,000 individuals were ready to shed the blood. the grandson of the Messenger of God. Is that not tragic enough? Is there not something that went wrong during the course of these 50 years or not? That's the question that we need to ask. This is point number one. But nonetheless, there is a whole host of still conversation that takes place in regards to how it is that we engage all of these pieces of literature. And I'll run through a couple of different opinions and I'll conclude for this evening, inshallah. Opinion number one is that anything and everything that has been reported when it comes toward the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is fair game for us to speak about. Because most of that which came down to us have been lost. Most of that which came down from us perhaps was via oral tradition. Some would argue that I take value from the stories and the anecdotes that my grandparents tell me. And those are the same anecdotes and narrations that their grandparents told them. And for decades and for centuries, we hear stories about our grandparents, about where they came from, about their legacies. So why should I not take from the stories and from the anecdotes that we hear with regards to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam and his tragedy? Again, this is perhaps a little bit problematic in terms of our understanding of history, because as we spoke about before, it's important for us to firstly go ahead and gather the sources and then differentiate between the primary and the secondary. And there's a danger naturally to take fact from poetic prose, for instance. Again, not that there's anything wrong with it, but at the end of the day, if we take it as fact and historical sort of proof and evidence for why certain things happen, then this could potentially be problematic. A second approach is that we should only rely upon the most early historical sources that we have in front of us today, meaning from the narration of the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf, narrated by At-Tabari, or that which was narrated by Shaykh al-Mufid. But at the end of the day, again, we're lacking with regards to the whole narrative of the tragedy of Karbala, because it's only that which has been deduced and deducted by scholars of the past. And so much of that perhaps was uncovered and revealed later on by scholars like that of Al-Majlisi, where he compiles some of the narrations of the Maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in Bihar al-Anwar. At the end of the day, the important thing is that when we take a look at the tragedy of Karbala, the story of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, that we take an approach that's accepting, but at the same time critical. That we take a balanced approach. Not that we accept anything and everything with regards to the tragedy, because we want to say that this is limiting the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. We have to use some sort of knowledge, some sort of process, some sort of methodology. But again, if we're focusing on details and not focusing upon the lesson and the themes that we're deriving, then we're going to focus upon, again, likely on the wrong things. I'll give you one example and I'll conclude for this evening. A couple of weeks ago, obviously during the 10 days of Muharram, as I was reciting Majalis for Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, as I'm driving back home to my home, my 6-year-old daughter, Zainab, make dua for her, she started asking me, she says, Baba, what was Ali Akbar wearing? I said, I don't know. She says, if he kills this many people, how tall was he? I said, I don't know. And then she said, Qasim, he's a small boy. How tall was he? And she starts going ahead and asking me all of these questions and all of these details. And I said, why are all of these things so important? She says, because you said in the Majlis that he killed this many people, and that he was short, which is why perhaps he couldn't ride on the horse, and that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam cut the piece of cloth so that he could wrap around his body. And her mind is focusing on the detail. And I realized at this moment that perhaps the way that we narrate the Majlis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam for many people, for perhaps many young people, is the fact that we focus in on the details so much that we're forgetting the importance of the message. At the end of the day, as much as it's my job to narrate the detail and the tragedy to my congregation, I also have to make sure that I'm teaching my daughter, at the end of the day, take some value and some lesson from the tragedy of Karbala. So I told her, you know what? We're not going to focus on the details so much. I want you to focus upon the courage, the sacrifice, the bravery of these individuals. Again, when you go back and take a look, sometimes it's important to hear the perspective of a 6-year-old child and the way that they examine and the way that they process all of that which is taking place, and perhaps how it might take us away again from the ultimate objective Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ إِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Take lesson from these stories. Are you not a people who contemplate? How many times does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say this within the whole of the Quran? And at the end of the day, like we know from Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam, at every opportunity that they got, they sought to remind their companions, their family members, their communities at the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. That at extent, when we take a look at the life of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, salamullah alayhi, every single opportunity that he gets, he seeks to revive his community with the remembrance of his father, Abu Abdullah. Every moment that he would walk into the marketplace and he would see that butcher shedding that blood of the sheep, he would say, "Oh butcher, did you give some water to the sheep before you sacrificed it, before you killed it?" He says, "Of course, O grandson of the Messenger of God. How would I not give this water how would I not give the sheep some water before I killed it?" To of course which the Imam alayhi salam would respond, "Then know that my father, Abu Abdullah Hussein, he was killed thirsty on the day of Ashura." Every single opportunity that the Imam alayhi salam he got, he was very quick to remind everyone of the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And what a tragedy it was. And really, my dear friends, when I go ahead and when I take a look at the tragedy of Karbala, I don't know of any moment perhaps that was more difficult on the back and on the shoulders of Lady Zainab alayhi salam as those last moments in the life of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein salamullah alayhi. For the report states that when the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad, they began to attack the body of Imam al-Hussein from the right and from the left, and when Shimr bin Diljoshan sits on the chest of our master Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, Lady Zainab alayhi salam, she exits from the tent and she climbs on top of the hill. And for those of you who have been to Karbala, you know that location known as Til al-Zainabi. She stands on top of that hill and she calls out to the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad. She says, "Oh army of Umar ibn Sa'ad, is there not a Muslim from amongst you? Is there not a believer from amongst you?" And all of them, while they glance at Zainab alayhi salam, none of them respond. Umar ibn Sa'ad, he then calls out to his army. He says, "Which one of you is going to do the deed?" And again, why it's so difficult for Zainab is that all of this tragedy is unfolding in front of her eyes. And I want you to imagine the scene as that dagger is raised and about to shed the blood of your master Abu Abdullah Hussein. Some state that Lady Zainab alayhi salam, she had a will to go and defend her brother Abu Abdullah. But as she takes those strides, and as that dagger is about to fall upon the neck of the Imam alayhi salam, Lady Zainab alayhi salam, perhaps she freezes, knowing that if she goes to defend her brother Abu Abdullah, who is going to take care of the children of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam that are crying of their thirst behind. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grief in our hearts, tears in our eyes, to allow for us to walk in the footsteps of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for our lives to resemble the lives of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, and for our death to resemble the death of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the ability and the tawfiq to take lesson, and to take inspiration, to take wisdom during the course of these days of the Majalis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive our sins, to cleanse and purify our hearts. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in this life, and offer us his intercession in the next life. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين ورحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآله. الفاتحة.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Hussein, Hussein,
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Hussein. آل عمران کہاں اور زندان کہاں، یہ بہن قید ہوئی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا۔ ہم کو پانی نہ ملے تیری خوشبو تو رہے، تیرے بازو نہ کٹیں چاہے مشکی داچھ دے، یہ مگر ہو نہ سکا تیرے بازو ہیں جدا، مجھ پہ ہے تشنہ لبی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، دھوپ میں تو تھا شجر تجھ سے آباد تھا گھر، ہے برے نام میرا سر کیا نہیں تجھ کو خبر، ہے علمدار وفا اس بہن کو بخدا، تجھ سے ڈھارس بھی بڑی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، آ گئی شام علم لٹ گئے اہل حرم، ریت پر جلتی ہوئی ہو گیا ٹھنڈا عالم، فرصت دینے کے لیے مجھ سے ملنے کے لیے آ گئے بابا علی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی، کیا کہوں شعر میرے بے ردا ہم کو لیے، یہ مسلمان سارے شہر در شہر گئے، خلقت کوفہ کبھی خلقت شام کبھی، بارہا ہم پہ ہنسی تو نہ آیا غازی، جب ردا سر سے چھنی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا کتنی بے بس تھی بہن اے شہنشاہ وفا نام لے لے کے میرا جب یہ ظالم نے کہا ناز تھا جس پہ تجھے اب بلاؤ نہ اسے اور میں روتی ہی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی جب ردا سر سے چھینی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی جب ردا سر سے چھینی میں صدا دیتی رہی تو نہ آیا غازی یا حسین 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 یا حسین
متوجہ زیارت
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام على رسول رب العالمين السلام على نبي الله السلام على محمد بن عبد الله السلام على أمير المؤمنين السلام على سيد الوسيين السلام على علي بن أبي طالب السلام عليك يا أم المؤمنين خديجة الكبرى السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين السلام عليك يا أبا محمد الحسن بن علي المجتبى السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا علي بن الحسين السجاد السلام عليك يا محمد بن علي الباقر السلام عليك يا جعفر بن محمد الصادق السلام عليك يا موسى بن جعفر الكاظم السلام عليك يا علي بن موسى الرضا السلام عليك يا محمد بن علي الجواد السلام عليك يا علي بن محمد الحادي السلام عليك يا حسن بن علي العسكري السلام عليك يا حجة بن الحسن المهدي السلام عليك يا صاحب الزمان السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته